From one sports fan to another, how are we doing? Welcome to episode 3 of 933 Sports. My name's Lucas. Happy to be here. Appreciate everybody who's been listening to the first two episodes. We've gotten a lot of great feedback on it, so thank you for that. Today's going to be a little bit different. I'm not really going to be talking any specific sports. I'm just going to be kind of doing some musing a little bit on doing some legacy talk. It's kind of just a word vomit a little bit. I don't know. I just kind of hit record and kind of see. I knew I wanted to talk about that and just kind of see where it took. Got 28 minutes out of it. We'll see. If people like it, great. I'll do more of it, especially with the especially as we move into late June, July before football starts. There'll be some time to do some of that. So if you like it, let me know. If you don't, also let me know. See. But yeah, appreciate y'all listening. Alrighty, so I was looking at it the other day, and you see the Minnesota Timberwolves defeat the Denver Nuggets in 6 games in the first round of the NBA playoffs. Anthony Edwards goes down with the injury. Minnesota's up 3-1 in the series. Denver wins game 5, excuse me. And then they lose game 6 and the series. And what I started thinking about is, the Denver Nuggets have Nikola Jokic, who is widely considered to be the best player in this generation of the NBA, just because of his complete skill set. He's a center that can shoot from anywhere, pass the ball with the skill of a point guard. You know, all-time great efficiency rating. He's like number 1 in every efficiency metric ever. And he's won all the personal accolades to prove it. He has multiple MVPs. He did win a ring 3 years ago, so he does have that box checked, which is also important for basketball. But especially the past 3 years, some pretty high-profile flameouts in the postseason. This is the second time the Nuggets have struggled and or collapsed against Minnesota just in the past 3 years. And so what I was thinking about is legacy, and not just for basketball, but for sports overall. Legacies define so much of the dialogue about sports, what we choose to talk about, how we choose to talk about them. Even with your buddies, whether it's a reflection on these were great players because XYZ, or could this guy be one of these great players because ABC? That is, you flip on ESPN right now, that's 90% of what they're talking about. Is, especially this time of year, it's very popular because, outside of NBA playoffs, baseball's still in the early part of the season. There's just not a whole lot going on in sports, especially once we start to move into late June and July. And so these conversations start to dominate the airwaves. And I don't like the conversation of what a guy could be. I think that's, any guy could be this. Brock Purdy was the Mr. Irrelevant. He was drafted last in the draft. Every other guy before him that was taken in that spot, did they even make the practice squad? But Brock Purdy started in a Super Bowl and got paid the big bucks and is going to be a starting quarterback for the 49ers for a while, And so any guy could be this or that, good or bad, great or terrible. And I've heard a lot of people say this, a lot of scouts especially. There is no such thing as a high floor, which I agree with. Any guy can be a complete and total flameout, regardless of how highly lauded they were coming out. Especially when you want to look at basketball. For every great high school or college basketball player that got drafted in the pros, look at some of the guys taken out straight out of high school. For every LeBron, Kobe, Kevin Garnett, there's like 2 or 3, Greg Odoms, Darko Milic, even Leitner to an extent, if we're being completely honest here. Anybody remember Jabari Parker? No? Like, what are we doing here? Like, so I think that's what's really interesting. Like, I like looking at legacies as a reflection of what was, and then once you get added that list, we start talking about. You have to deserve to be in that conversation before we start having that conversation. Like, clip popped up on ESPN the other day. Is Dak Prescott going to be an all-time great quarterback? Dak Prescott has not earned that yet. He could be, he couldn't be. Time will tell. I have my opinions on that question, honestly, but once again, I'm not going to answer that because I don't believe that's how we should be approaching this conversation. Like, is it fun to speculate with your buddies when you're having a couple of drinks? Like, I remember doing the math with a friend one time. We were looking at Mahomes' career numbers, and we were kind of just running some averages, running some numbers, and it's like, if he keeps up the pace he's currently on for the next 10 years, this is where he would end up. This is where you'd be on the all-time leaderboards. Like, and that kind of stuff is fun to speculate, but who knows? I mean, especially, Mahomes just tore his ACL into the season this past year, and he definitely, the past 2 years have been statistically poor, especially by his standards. And so I don't think it's great to speculate because anything and everything could happen. We've seen it with sports a million times. I mean, we love to talk about the underdog, but then we assume the underdog's never going to happen when it comes to these sports. I mean, just look at the Giants beating the Patriots in 07 as a perfect example. So, what I really wanted to talk about today when it comes to legacies is, what has been and some of the crazy ways we construe these conversations. And the first one I want to start with is, like, so often, and this I'll start with basketball because it's kind of the best example of this, is we kind of have a cutoff of when the modern era starts. Everything before that is great. You're still a legend. We still respect what you did for the game, but it was just a different league. Guys weren't on the same training regimens, workout routines that they are now. They just weren't as athletically gifted as they are now. And so you dominated at that level. You wouldn't necessarily dominate today. We don't really talk about you as much. And so basketball is a great example because if you ask the average individual, at least this is what I believe, the modern era of basketball, when that type of stuff started to count truly, is the 79-80 season. There's a couple of guys whose careers overlap that. Kareem is the big example. And Kareem had his greatest years, honestly, even before that. So we kind of include him. But really, like, Will Russell, Jerry West, even, like, they kind of are that pre-modern NBA era. Dr. J, even to a certain extent, especially because you had the ABA, so the league was kind of split. Not all the best players were competing against each other. And so it just kind of got a little funky. And so we're like, okay, modern era of basketball starts 1979 draft because that's when Larry Bird and Magic Johnson are taken. And it kind of kickstarts this modern era of basketball that has grown into what we see now. The 80s, you had the Showtime Lakers, Bird McHale Celtics, which then goes into the Bad Boy Pistons, Jordan's dynasty with the Bulls. The Rockets get there too while Jordan was retired. Like, you can continue that train on and on and on until you get to modern day. And kind of the reason for that being is how much the game changed in such a quick period of time. I mean, there was a point, not that long before Bird and Magic were drafted where the three-point shot did not exist in the NBA. And while even still relative to 40 years ago, the three-pointer is a much bigger part of the game today, it was at least there, and it was at least something that was utilized and recognized. And I think that's And so it makes it a lot easier for us to have some of those conversations. And especially, too, we start to see this, especially when you look at the Showtime Lakers and how they played. So much of what they did, they started to do at a team level, was something that really only the best players did before that era of basketball. You'd see the flash and the style really just from a couple of guys and not necessarily a team orchestrated effort. And so there was a lot more identity. There was a lot more Showtime. That's why they called it that. And because they were successful, they invited people to imitate what they were doing. And so now you see it get spread to across the entire league. Everybody's doing it. All the best players are doing it. It's way easier to evaluate, okay, well, this guy's a great player because of this. This guy's a great player because of this. And it's way more defined. And like Kareem, you talk about Flash. Like he kind of is the holdover from that. Kareem, the hook shot. I mean, it's iconic. It's arguably the most iconic shot in the history of basketball when you look at its uniqueness. And so when we getting back to my point, when we talk about legacies, we often just have these cutoffs of, well, this is when it really started. And part of it too is just like, what do people remember? Because, you know, especially you look at generations, like the baby boomers that grew up watching some of these older players starting to die. I mean, Babe Ruth played 100 years ago. If we want to talk baseball, Babe Ruth's an all-time great baseball player. He's on every leaderboard. Everybody understands, like, he's the Babe, great Bambino, Sultan of SWAT, like, all-time great. He also played 100 years ago, and he was guzzling hot dogs on a daily basis. And YouTube Babe Ruth swing, and honestly, like, YouTube his swing, that's what you tell a kid not to do in today's baseball. It is ugly. But it was just how they played the game of baseball that day. Like, what they did for the game, these guys, before we really start these modern eras of these games, what those guys did to build the game up to what it is, absolutely. Can't be denied. Like, we have to respect, like, sticking with baseball, Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, Lou Gehrig, like, thank you for your contribution to the game, but it's kind of hard to evaluate you relative to the modern day. And so, like, when we talk about legacy, like, I do think it's important to start looking at it from a perspective of when were sports modernized and made popular. And 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 that's varying degrees. And it's really different, especially with basketball and it's kind of a twofold conversation. Because when you talk about sports being modernized, this literally just popped into my head. We talk about it. Well, imagine if Babe Ruth was on, like, Shohei Ohtani's workout routine. Like, imagine if he was on that workout routine, on the diet, like he wasn't, you know, overweight and like indulgent all the indulgences that he had off the field during the season. Like, if he wasn't doing all that, not only, but then on top of that, like, look at the equipment these guys are using. Especially, you want to talk about basketball and the growth of the shoe game over the years, the technology that goes into that. Golf's a great example of this because, like, I'm sorry, but like the clubs you're using at even at a local muni sometimes are like nicer than like the wooden clubs that they were using for like that, like Ben Hogan was using. Like, so we do have to give them the benefit there. Where we take away from them, we also do have to give them some benefit, but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, we had not maximized the potential of what the sport could be. And that's not even these guys' fault. It's just, it's kind of unfortunate timing. And so I definitely want to talk about it because and then there's an added element to it. Let me back up. There's an added element to that when you start to talk about sports where positions matter. And of course, sport where position matters most, especially in the conversation of legacies, is football. Especially when it comes to positional value, like, quarterback is valued so much more highly. When you look at all-time great leaderboards, you have, Brady's obviously the GOAT. Peyton Manning's up there. If you want to throw it back a couple more years, a lot of people want to throw Dan Marino on there. But, like, what we've seen, even in recent history, is the growth of the passing game. And so while we are so quick to say the quarterback's the most valued position, that person's the GOAT, well, look at even 40 years ago. 40 years ago, 1986, the Bears just won the Super Bowl in January 86. And who's their best offensive player? I mean, he's the punky QB. McMahon was not their best offensive player. It was Walter Payton. Like, that was obvious to everybody with a brain. And at that time especially, you had one running back, you gave him the ball all the time, and the rushing attack was way more part of the offense. Great example of this, look at Super Bowl III. Joe Namath, who is considered, honestly, you look at his numbers, he's not considered an all-time great, and this is part of what I'm saying. Super Bowl III, Joe Namath is like, I guarantee we're going to win, even though we're underdogs. They win. Great story. Awesome. Joe Namath threw for 207 yards and a touchdown, which in today's NFL, like, yeah, no turnover. You didn't throw any picks, but barely cracked 200 yards, only one touchdown. Like, eh. But at that time, everybody was like, holy crap, he threw for 200 yards. Like, feels like in the past, like, 50, 60 years, passing yards, passing statistics and their inflation has, like, coincided with inflation, like, just monetary inflation, because, like, nowadays, it's like, yeah, you threw for 200 yards and a touchdown, like, but your team still lost because you only scored 17 points and the other team scored 24. Like, what are we doing? So when we talk about these legacies, especially in football, like, look at it this way. After get off and look at the top 10 leaders all time in passing yards. Matt Ryan is like number 10 or number 9. Kirk Cousins is like top 15 or top 20. And we crap on Kirk Cousins specifically, especially you look at the past couple of years. Like, these guys, the standard is just so much different. And it's not comparable. But on the flip side of that, you look at the running back position, like Walter Payton's number 2 to Emmitt Smith all time in rushing yards. Like, nobody's ever passing those guys. Like, you had Frank Gore get super high up there a couple of years ago, but, like, running backs just aren't used in the same way. And so when we have these conversations, especially with football, when does that cutoff really start? It's kind of tough to say. Oh, you could say Dan Marino in the 90s, but even then it's kind of dicey. If you really want to push it up to, like, Y2K, like, Brady gets drafted early 2000s, that's right. It kind of lines up perfectly with Kurt Warner and The Greatest Show on Turf. It's very easy to say you could start there. But you could almost say, like, the value of the quarterback didn't truly start until the 21st century. Like, there's an argument to be made. And so when we talk about the legacies of the guys before that, like, you could almost push it back further. I mean, Joe Montana, before Brady, before the 21st century, Joe Montana was considered the greatest quarterback of all time because Bill Walsh, Montana, Jerry Rice, like, they had all the Super Bowls in the 80s. They were the prevailing dynasty, and Joe Montana, I mean, he's like maybe top 20 in passing yards all time. And that's not to take anything away from him. It was just the way the game was played at the time. It's just like, these guys, they just weren't doing it as much. And part of it is, too, it goes back to what I was saying with basketball and baseball. Like, They weren't on the same training regimens. They weren't on the same diets necessarily, especially when you look at it too, just the physical gifts and how they were coached. Like, yeah, they were running around, but like, why? Like, they weren't doing what, like, Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson are doing in the backfield these days. Now it's just commonplace. I mean, you look at any rookie coming out, you look at even Cam Ward, who's had a really rough rookie season, or Caleb, who had a rough rookie season 2 years ago. When they were coming out, they were lauded for the crazy throws and running around and making stuff happen. Like, quarterbacks just didn't do that. And so that wasn't an expectation. And but it's also still hard to talk about them as great. Like, it's hard to talk about them as being better than X, Y, or Z guys sometimes because they don't have the numbers. And it's difficult because, and this is especially true when you talk about basketball and you start talking about Wilt Chamberlain, talks about Bill Russell, and I mentioned this earlier. They they played so long ago, and people just don't remember watching it. Like, so many of the people that watched it are dying out, and so there's just not enough people to remember that. But you start talking about and you start talking about, like, look at football. Brady has all the rings, all the yards, all the touchdowns. And yeah, he was a pocket passer. He was just a drop back throw kind of guy. But when you're number one on all the charts, you have so many records that look absolutely unbreakable because nobody's going to play long enough to break them. Same thing with LeBron. Like, it's I don't think it's going to be the same thing in 30 years from now where it's like, oh, well, were they really that good? Now we'll see. I don't know. But I do think it's interesting. I don't think we're going to have that same kind of reset because at a certain point, I do think we max out just how much training and workout these guys can put into it. And so when I think legacy talk is so interesting. It's one of my favorite aspects of sports. And what it's so cool because when we can start talking about a guy as an all-time legend and we can start to compare him, and it's especially fun like when we know he's an all-time legend but he's still playing and he still has a chance to add to that and move up. That's when his best, because although I don't like talking what ifs, when you've earned the right to enter into that conversation, even if you're still playing, you can start like, because when Brady's sitting there with 5 Super Bowls after beating the Falcons in Super Bowl 51, it's like, yeah, he has 5 rings and 3 MVPs. We have to talk about this guy as like an all-time great, even if same thing with Mahomes. Like, Patrick Mahomes has 3 Super Bowls, 2 MVPs. Like, if he retired tomorrow, he'd still be an all-time great. He'd still be on a Hall of Famer just because of those accolades alone. Now, yeah, maybe his counting stats wouldn't be as good as some of these other guys, but he still has that stuff. And then that's kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's hard for us to talk about maybe some of these guys, but like, yeah, Joe Montana has how many Super Bowls? Like, it's a lot more than a lot of guys, especially you look at Peyton Manning only has 2, Rodgers only has 1, Brett Favre only has 1, Dan Marino has 0. Like, it's a combination of all of that. And that's what I love about it. And that's what I think too makes baseball so different. And honestly, in some ways kind of worse to talk about as much as I love baseball. Like, it's really just the counting stats and the averages, batting average, OPS, stuff like that. Because one player could only impact the game so much, especially nowadays, that it's difficult for us to talk GOAT stuff. Now, obviously, what Ohtani's doing, I mean, that's been talked about to death, pitching and hitting. We haven't seen it since Babe Ruth, and even then, Babe never really did it both at the same time. Like, that's maximizing how much impact one guy can have. And so, like, but it's hard to talk about the sport, because especially when it comes to rings, like it's just hard to win a ring as one guy in baseball. I mean, look at the team Ohtani left. He was there in Anaheim. I'm calling it Anaheim. I don't care. He was there in Anaheim with Mike Trout, who's still there. And Mike Trout's considered, arguably, before Ohtani came into the league, the best baseball player of his generation. He was there in Anaheim with Ohtani, and they couldn't make the playoffs. Like, there's just so much only one guy can do. And, Barry Bonds never won a World Series. He he only played in one. And so, but when you look at the leaderboard, I mean, obviously Barry Bonds has a chokehold on the all-time home run list, and you look at the guys in baseball that did win a ring. Ohtani's another great example. He goes to the Dodgers. He needs, the flipping Avengers. I wouldn't say he needed all of them, but it definitely helped. Like, I mean, they've gone back to back, for crying out loud. And it's the same thing in baseball. Look at the great teams that win; they're stacked, and it's because you have to build a diverse, well-rounded roster. And I think that's a lot. That's why I like baseball. That's what makes baseball so different. Is because, like, well, when it comes to these individualized conversations, it's why you don't really talk baseball on the talk shows as much, because you have to get so much more into the weeds on individual teams and lineups. It does make it more interesting because you have to talk about teams and you have to talk about well-rounded lineups. I mean, like, look at a great example is this. Alex Rodriguez was on some great Mariner teams when he came into the league, of course, and then he's still great winning MVPs, goes to Texas, still great winning MVPs. Rangers are terrible because A-Rod's the only guy they have. Finally ends up joining up with Jeter in the Yankees, wins a World Series in 2009. Oh, hey, there you go. Alex Rodriguez has a ring, but he needed to get a lot of help to get there. And that's true for any sport. Like, that's true for baseball. That's just how it works. And I think that's why we're so much harsher, especially when it comes to basketball players, because it's like you're one of 5 guys on the court. You got to do well. Like, and I mean, more to the point of that, like, I'm only talking about team sports. Look at golf. It's just you. Now, we look at players in golf the same way we kind of look at teams in sports, so I don't really get into that as, like, it's pretty obvious. Like, Tiger has 15 majors, Jack has 18. Like, you just kind of go down the major list, and it's like, okay, there's your all-time great list. Like, it's kind of is what it is for that one. But with these team sports, it is varying degrees of how much impact does this guy have on the game. And so it's always interesting to talk legacies. I know this is a little bit different. It's just kind of some musings on that. It is very interesting right now because there's not a whole lot going on in the sports world. I mean, you got NBA playoffs, some great Game 7s this past weekend. Loved watching the Sixers beat the Celtics Saturday night. I thought Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey looked absolutely unstoppable, but then the Knicks blew out the 76ers last night, so we'll see on that one. Knicks, and then they were coming off that. I mean, I don't think there's a word to describe what the Knicks did to the Hawks in Game 6, but the Knicks are looking pretty good. Extremely good as of late. So we'll see. They have a very good chance of winning the East, I think. So that's going to be scary. And then, Ant's back for the Timberwolves. We'll see if they can make 3 straight conference finals. I think OKC, Minnesota would be a very interesting conference finals. Either way, it'll be fun to see how the NBA shakes out. But outside of that, baseball's kind of early season still. As Cardinals are looking great, Weatherholt, Jordan Walker finally is popping. Like, he's finally doing what we thought he was going to do like 2-3 years ago. Thank goodness. And then, Alec Burleson as well. So we've got a nice young core coming in, but, they'll probably get poached by big market teams soon. But even still, baseball's still in the early season stages, so can't really talk about that. There's not a ton to talk about there. I mean, but outside of that, it's just not. It's kind of a dead time for sports, and so I thought I'd do some music on that today. Might do some more of it soon some other stuff I want to talk about, but that's all for now. Have a great rest of your day. Appreciate you listening. Yeah, have a good one.